right, how's it going, everybody? Zach here. I'm excited to be back with you. Week 3. It's flying by, just like July's flying by. So we're still on our series, God in the Pandemic, and we're in the 3rd week. We're talking about God in the New Testament. We left off last week talking about the Old Testament, and I thought it was important that we talk about the Old Testament because many things when we think about God and we think about the coronavirus, we get a picture of God, and it tends to be a very simple, very narrow view of God in the Old Testament. It's very much like God does bad things to bad people, good things to good people, and we know that that kind of breaks down, and it doesn't work out as easily as we thought it did. It's not something as simple as that. Sometimes there are cases where that takes place, but then, as we talked about, there's stories like Job, where Job's a good guy and bad things happen to him. And that tells us that there's more that's going on than we realize. That yes, there is wickedness and badness in the world, but there's also God redeeming what's taking place, and that's what's happening there. If we have the simple view of God, just bad things happen to bad people, good things happen to good people, then when we think about the pandemic, what we'll think about is, well, then that means like people who are affected by COVID negatively must have done something bad. But we've all probably know somebody who has, or maybe we have been ourselves. And we know, like, I didn't do anything like bad, or at least not bad enough to warrant this type of suffering, or somebody I know is, been impacted by it. It's like, it doesn't seem fair. They seem like they were, not perfect, but not deserving of this. So we have to develop a deeper picture of what God is like to understand that. And when we get through the Old Testament, God is doing this redeeming act. It's this making new of creation, but we don't see like what's happening or what's taking place until we get into the New Testament. And that starts with Jesus. Jesus is the defining moment. Every story has a defining moment if you think about it. Like, all stories have this moment where we're like, oh my gosh, like this is it. This is like make it or break it right now. What's going to happen? Right now I'm watching the Star Wars films, and I'm watching them in the chronological order. So we started from episode 1, and now we're getting to episode 4, right? Like, this is kind of the big one. This is a 1977, like a first Star Wars film where we're introduced to characters like Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. And in this film, the defining moment, right, is near the end when they're battling like over the Death Star, this huge machine that can destroy planets and life as they know it. And Luke has a job or responsibility to basically do like a 1 in a million odds of trying to shoot his missile in this like one small hole that's like just perfectly sized for a missile. And blow up the Death Star. But it's such an impossible shot. And we get to the point where he's got like one missile left. And like, this is it. Like, this is the make it or break it moment. This is the defining moment. If he misses this shot, I mean, there's no hope left. But if he doesn't, then we start to see like what could like actually take place. And what does take place is he ends up, by using the Force, is able to get the shot perfectly in there, blows up the Death Star, and brings, there's peace that's there, and then as the movies continue, there are other defining moments in these films. More recently, we think about like all the comic book superhero movies that are coming out. They all have defining moments. The most memorable probably is when the first Avengers came out, right? In that movie, the Avengers, like all these superhero characters coming together, but they're not getting along. They're even fighting with one another and battling. But the defining moment comes when like New York is in like terror, and the world really is, and they have to come together in New York to defeat this enemy. And you got the iconic picture of them like circled together, ready to battle New York. This is like the defining moment. This is that make it or break it moment. So all good stories have a defining moment. They have this moment, this is like really, this is it. And when we look at the biblical story, that moment is Jesus. Jesus comes, and he is that moment where he is looking at the past, looking at Israel's, there's the evil, there's the suffering, what we've talked about, but he's also looking to the future, toward what God is doing, toward God's redemption of creation, and he's making it happen. He announces God's kingdom is coming, that this is going to happen, this is going to take place. He's healing people, healing the sick, those who are blind are receiving their sight. People are made whole. The evil and suffering that was there is being undone. So we see him start to do that. And the crazy part about this is Jesus just isn't some random miracle worker, but he's God himself. So the defining moment is when we tend to think of God in this kind of far, abstract area, we actually see what God truly is, entering into humanity, becoming a human, and working that out, working and making things new. But he's entering into the pain and the suffering of the world. Now, you might have gone through confirmation class or something, and you know that God is fully man, fully human. But when we really start to see that and understand it, we see that what that means is that we have this character, we have Jesus, who is not an abstract version of God, like far in the distance. We have a God who is like close to us, who is there in the midst of our suffering, who wants to make things new. But it's a process, coming out. And he enters into our suffering so much. I mean, he suffers himself. We know this through the crucifixion, right? We all know the crucifixion story is like the worst suffering that could happen. More suffering than any of us could imagine. He goes through that. But he also is with us in the midst of our suffering. The most memorable, one of the most memorable stories of that you've probably heard is with Lazarus, right? Lazarus is Jesus' friend, and Jesus gets word that he has died. And the ending of the story we're all familiar with, right? Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. We like that part. But before that, I mean, he gets there. Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, are crying. They're upset. They're a little mad at him. Like, if you would have been here, would have been different. What does Jesus do? He listens to them. He comforts them. He reminds them who he is, what will happen. But he also cries with them. The shortest verse of the Bible, the New Testament, is Jesus weeps. He's just crying. He's there, and they're all crying. And he's crying with them. We do get to a point where he does raise Lazarus from the dead, and it's an amazing moment. But we start to think back, like, why didn't you just do that immediately, Jesus, right? Like, why didn't you just snap your fingers and then all of a sudden it's gone? Like the pain is gone, the suffering is gone, Lazarus is just okay. And we think about that with COVID, like, God, why don't you just snap your fingers and COVID's gone and like everything is good? But that's part of the narrow picture that we have of God, is like, God, you're supposed to do this. Like, good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. God is almost like an equation that we've made where it's like, this is supposed to happen. And God doesn't operate the way we think he does. Jesus does a lot of things before he raises Lazarus from the dead. And we see that God is still doing those things for us and through us. But when we think about COVID, we have to understand what Jesus is doing. Jesus is there to listen to us when we're angry. He's there to comfort us. He's there to remind us what will happen, what he will do. And he is there to do it, and we see that new creation come in. But it's a process, and it doesn't happen on our timing. It doesn't happen as we want it to be. So God is making things new. He's doing it every day. But there's still evil, there's still pain, there's still suffering. We're kind of in that defining moment. And COVID might have crushed a lot of your hopes and dreams for the year. Maybe you were really excited about your school year. You had certain plans that maybe you were going from elementary to middle school, so that was a big moment, or middle school to high school. You thought this was going to be the year. You thought that this was going to be like my time, like I had this all planned out. Maybe you planned to go to school in person, but now you have to go online. And your plans didn't work out exactly as you thought. We can get mad at God, we can be upset, but God, in that midst of all that, he just listens to us, he comforts us, he cares for us. He reminds us what he's going to be doing and how he's working through it, how that already is happening, and he gives us hope for the future that he is. But we have to think about that God is more than what we'd expect, that God isn't just limited to our scope of assuming, like, snap your fingers, it's all over, that's it, like, we're okay. God works on his timing. But we have to remember he enters into our suffering. He is not far away from it. He is really close to us, closer than we can imagine. So when we're suffering, when we feel this pain, when we're really upset, sad, mad, upset because we can't see our friends or certain family members, we can't go and do what we want to do, or whatever the case is, whatever, maybe you're just worried about being, just whatever the impact of COVID's going to be. But we have to remember God is with us. He's there and He's suffering with us, but He's also working to make things new. But it's happening on His time. So think about that this week as you go throughout your day, throughout your week. There will be often times where you feel like, God, why does this have to, why today? And we need a much larger picture of God. God, who is Jesus Himself, that defining moment, entering into humanity, comforting us, caring for us, listening to us, being there for us. God in the flesh, He is there with us in your suffering. Think about that this week. Have a good week, everybody.